The Centre presents a new podcast, CBME and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Welcome back to CB Me and You, a podcast about biomedical ethics. Today, we discuss traditional Asian medicine. What is it? Is it science or pseudoscience? Should you use it? When my auntie tells me to eat more yogurt, should I do it? Joining us today is CBME's very own Dr. Kathryn Muyskens, who will answer all of our questions. Welcome, Kat.
Hi.
Just some low expectations there for Kat today.
I have 50 questions about the universe.
Okay. Where do we begin? Well, there was a big bang. Some sciencey things happened.
I feel like we're glossing over some details here.
My brain is running through the Big Bang Theory song right now. That's honestly how I think about the start of the universe.
Yes.
So we have some icebreakers for you, some questions. So coffee or copy?
Copy.
Oh, excellent. Just plain copy or like...
Copy si kosong peng.
Get it, girl. So for our listeners...
I've been here a while.
For our listeners, kopi si kosong peng is iced coffee with evaporated milk, less sugar.
No sugar.
No sugar. Oh,
And
so close.
yes.
So close. Okay. Next question. What country do you want to travel to the most?
Okay. So Portugal is on my list. Haven't been there. No current plans to go. No occasion for it. But one day.
One day.
It's an expression of desire, not so much an expression of plans.
Yeah, we're not pressing you on how many details you have. And last question, my favorite. What's your go-to karaoke song?
Yes. And so this is the one that I knew is coming because I know you. And so I prepared an answer, but I couldn't pick just one. So the first one is pass. Second, no. Third, how dare you? And also, why?
Okay.
One of those must be a song.
Yeah, I think they're probably all songs. We'll hold you to it.
Okay, when you find a song called Pass, let me know.
All right, I will.
It is like one of those, Spotify playlists where people make it up and like it's just different songs, but when you read it from the list, it makes sense.
Absolutely not. No way.
Over my dead body.
Yeah. Oh, I love that one. It's got a nice ring to it.
I feel like you're writing a whole album here.
Yeah. The CBME album.
Track 7,
Yes.
Go Away.
Go away. Yes, my favorite.
Thank you.
All right, now for some real questions. Okay, so the first thing we want to start with is definitions. So What is the definition of traditional medicine? Is it just this hodgepodge of random ideas that are associated with tradition? For example, if some auntie comes up to me and says, "Oh, blah 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 is heaty and blah 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 is cooling," does that count as medicine?
Okay, those are actually two excellent questions in there. The first was what counts as tradition, and the other one is actually what counts as medicine. So I think those are both valid questions to ask. But talking about labels first, just with the notion of traditional medicine, I think ordinarily people think of that as any sort of tradition of medicine that's connected with an ethnicity or culture that has a long history. So we think of things like traditional Chinese medicine. You might think of Ayurveda for Indian medicine. And there's others as well. But I think it's a great question because this is a really controversial category as well. So how old does something have to be called traditional? What's the boundary between something that's a folk remedy, like the fact that you drink cranberry juice if you have a bladder infection, versus going to an acupuncturist for traditional medicine, if you want to call it that. So that's some of the difficulty with the traditional label. People have tried some other labels in the past and still trying some now. Like people have called it vernacular medicine to try to link in the kind of folk tradition. And then there's another popular category called complementary and alternative medicine. So all of these things, I think they have their problems and limitations because they set this up as a category that is not real medicine. Like by adding that adjective, it separates it from whatever you think of as mainstream medicine or real medicine, maybe. So there's always a little bit of othering happening with that label.
Okay, so like, what if, when we think about medicines like stories about how to cure hiccups, for example, or hangovers, where would those fall in the spectrum of conventional medicine to quote unquote traditional medicine? Because even Western culture comes with a lot of like folk remedy ideas, right? Like, drink a Bloody Mary to cure a hangover.
Okay, I wouldn't call that Western medicine.
It's the best of modern science. but like there's a lot of folk ideas about what counts as medicine. Yeah. And I guess that really blurs the line between what we conventionally see as traditional medicine and what we call like Western medicine or science.
So I would say the labels are always imperfect. So I'm trying to separate out this notion of what counts as a medical practice to begin with the notion of what counts as a traditional medicine. So what you mentioned earlier there, like drinking a Bloody Mary for a hangover or cures for hiccups, I would say that that's generally just not medical. That's like folk practices that might relate to your health, but they're not addressing a particular medical problem, right?
I don't feel bad, and it fixes me.
Okay, yeah, you know what? You convinced me.
Using that, I could just say that a chocolate bar is...
James is a doctor, you know?
Not yet. I have a question. I think that, all of this discussion about labels got me thinking, are they important to have these sorts of labels? Do they have any meaning? Like, is traditional medicine regulated differently? Do you get more subsidies for one than the other? Like, what is important about giving it a very specific label?
So we can continue talking about the category of tradition, right? So a claim to tradition is a claim to often like an ancient ancestry or cultural importance sometimes. And that's something interesting within the study of these practices is to question how traditional they are, in fact. So what people now think of as traditional Chinese medicine, if you go to a acupuncture clinic, you go to someone who has a degree in traditional Chinese medicine, the stuff that they learn and practice was codified by Mao. And it comes from earlier practices that were folk traditions in China, but he sort of sifted it through and standardized it for the Chinese state. So, and then he used it as a way to export that across the world as a kind of soft power outreach for China. So that's what people think of, or that's the kind of TCM that you will encounter. It has roots at least that far back. How similar it is to earlier versions is kind of up for debate, I think. You can see that some of the practices have long histories, others don't. And it's a living practice as well, so it keeps developing and changing.
Thank you. I was wondering, there's mixed evidence about the effectiveness of different traditional Chinese medicine treatments. So how do we go about moving through this space? If some work, some don't, how are we supposed to know which ones work? And why should we take traditional Chinese medicine seriously given the uncertainty of the evidence?
Okay, so in the work that I've been doing with this, I think it's important to try to understand traditional Chinese medicine and other traditional medicines on their own terms. So to see what counts as effective, you have to know what the goals of the practice are. And TCM, many of the treatments that it would prescribe don't map onto any analogous Western medical condition. So, a lot of TCM remedies or things like that are not even addressing a illness in particular. They might be aimed at longevity or clarifying your qi or making you overall more healthy, something like a holistic sense of health. So there isn't necessarily a concrete problem that they're trying to fix or overcome. But of course, this depends on which thing you're talking about. That's why I think you asked the question well to say which treatments have evidence for efficacy and which don't. Because there there have been some remedies from TCM that have been shown to be effective for diseases that Western medicine also recognizes, like malaria. I can't remember her name right now, but someone won a Nobel Prize a while ago for proving the efficacy of this herb called artemisinin against malaria. And that knowledge came from TCM originally, from the old texts and old remedies.
That's fascinating. I actually didn't know that about malaria. That's so exciting.
You said that it's important to take certain traditions and certain practices or set of practices on their own terms, right? I'm just worried that this might be a bit too permissive because it could kind of like create justification for almost anything. For example, maybe slightly controversially, take something like astrology. Sorry to all the astrology fans out there. If we assess it, quote unquote, on its own terms, we might find that it's really successful at doing whatever it seems to try to be setting out to achieve. So I'm wondering if there's anything we can say to I guess, up the rigor a little bit.
Okay, so that's another good question. So I think this comes down to what do we mean by taking traditional medicines seriously? And that doesn't have to mean that we treat them as though they are facts. I think one of the things that's important to me is to look for respectful engagement with the people who take these things seriously. So medicine is there's various ways of defining it. You can define it as an applied science. That's a popular way of thinking about it. It's also a profession, a social institution, and I like to think of it as a relationship. So there's people involved. There's patients and doctors, and you want to look after their health if that's the goal of medicine, and that must involve respect for them. So in taking traditional medicine seriously, I don't think it means that we have to treat it as though it's all factual. I think that you want to try to meet people where they're at least. So one of the reasons that got me into this is realizing that traditional medicines are very commonly engaged with in places like Singapore. So something like 45% of people might have engaged in TCM within the past year. But they often don't disclose this to their Western medical doctors when they see them. And part of that is that they're afraid of being shamed or scolded because those practices are kind of seen as maybe backward or traditional, whereas Western medicine is seen as modern and progressive or has a kind of prestige and authority that they feel like doesn't gel with their traditional values. So I think that's a barrier that needs to be overcome. And with more respectful engagement, you can have a more real meeting of minds between patients and practitioners and Western medical professionals as well.
I like what you said about respecting TCM on its own terms and recognizing that perhaps the goals of TCM don't always match up with the goals of Western medicine, and that's okay. People can have their own values and see their bodies in the ways that they wish to. However, I think that that's, fairly justifiable when it doesn't cause harm to the person's body. I'm not familiar with teas and herbs, so maybe like consuming them really doesn't actually affect any or track any physiological changes to the body, but the person derives value from it nonetheless. What happens though when, certain practices are actually harmful to the person? Should we be regulating that even though we're saying we should match it on its own terms?
Yeah, so that's a good line to draw, I think, is the harm to people. And I think, again, engaging seriously with traditional medicines can facilitate that. You have to look at what they're actually prescribing before you can tell if any of that might actually be harmful or dangerous to people. So I do think that's important. I think harm is an important line to draw in the sand. So if things are non-harmful and important to people, but not necessarily proven to be effective, I think people should be allowed to choose them. I think there's a little bit more to say about that line of harm, though, because really hardline skeptics about traditional medicines or anti-traditional alternative practices, people would say that it's all harmful because it's all opportunity cost. If you are spending money, then you're being harmed, essentially. That if you're going to give your money to the acupuncturist and it's not really doing anything for you, then that's still a harm. I wouldn't draw the line there because I think people can derive value beyond just like a clinically measurable outcome. So sometimes I think actually a lot of medicine, even Western medicine, can be somewhat placebo. And so like if you're going to say that you can't do that in traditional medicine and that's a harm, then you're going to have to find a lot more practices in Western medicine and weed them out too. And actually, in my opinion, placebo's not that bad. Like sometimes maybe I do need a placebo. If I feel better, that's what matters to me. So if all I needed was you to put some needles in me and hold my hand for an hour, like maybe that's good.
So we have you on the record as saying it's good to deceive yourself sometimes.
Sometimes.
As long as it makes you feel good. What about trickier cases? For example, if there's a risk that, if we know that some treatment is not harmful, but there's a risk that some people will take that treatment and in the place of effective treatment. For example, somebody saying, I don't need a vaccine because I'm already like sniffing crystals or something.
Okay. Exciting.
Yeah.
All right.
And by crystals, I mean quartz.
Quartz, specifically.
Yeah.
James knows his crystals.
Yes. Okay. So on that note, you chose the vaccine example. So the obvious response would be like, if you're putting other people at risk, then that shouldn't necessarily be indulged. It depends on what the risk is that you're exposing people to. If you say, I'd rather ward off the flu with my quartz, and not get the flu shot this year, I think that's something you're allowed to decide. If it's, a pandemic and you would rather treat it with crystals, maybe the calculus is different.
I mean, we often let patients prioritize other values outside the traditional scope of what we see as health, or in the Western view of what health means. We allow patients to choose religion over health and to decline blood transfusions over reasons of faith. So I think that it's fair. Like if a patient wants to pursue traditional Chinese medicine because that has greater value to them than what Western medicine says.
Yeah.
And I think you have a good point.
Yeah. So that's why the vaccine case was a little bit more complicated, because if you're putting other people at risk, then you might not be permitted to do that in the same way as like putting yourself at risk. People do that all the time. And as long as we think that you're a competent adult, we have to respect that. To respect autonomy means you respect people's choices to sometimes make, or decisions to make sometimes ill-informed choices, or choices that you disagree with.
Yeah. So it seems like there's definitely a bit of a spectrum in which we can put different specific kinds of treatment. On one hand, we have things that we can prove have at least some positive effect. On the other hand, there are things that might be downright harmful. And in the middle, you have things that may be doing something and maybe a placebo or something like that. So if I'm interested in traditional medicine or TCM, how do I navigate? How can I navigate this sort of landscape, given that the standards of just looking at scientific journals and all that don't seem to quite apply as easily?
So you're wondering how to navigate the realm of traditional medicines when you can't rely on scientific journal articles, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, that's presuming that you're already someone who's interested in using and consuming a traditional medicine.
If I'm not interested, then it's not an issue.
Yeah. So, I have used TCM. I have found it to be helpful. And I would admit to myself that some of that might be placebo. It could be. I don't know. I don't know what the causal relationship is between the herbs that I might take or that they might recommend and whatever's happening. But sometimes it does help to just go and talk to somebody. And so one of the things that I like about TCM is the sort of difference in the epistemic landscape between doctor and patient. So for anyone out there who has like a chronic condition that they might have to go in to see a medical professional often, you might have experienced a feeling of disempowerment when you go to see a Western-style doctor. There's a lot about the style of delivery of Western medicine that is set up in what we'd call an epistemically opaque way. It's not clear to you as a patient what all these machines do, what all the chemical interactions might be with the drugs. Someone could explain that to you, but will you understand? I don't. I have a PhD in philosophy. I still don't understand these things. So there's a lot of feeling of vulnerability. And I mean, we call patients patients. It's sort of a passive role to be placed in. What I, as a patient, have liked about TCM is the feeling of a lot more epistemic empowerment. And this is very different from saying that, like, I know that these treatments are factually correct or map onto a concrete, real condition. But if my TCM doctor says, oh, you have spleen Qi deficiency, and you know what? Spleen Qi is orange, and you should eat orange things. That's very accessible to me. Like, I know what to do. And that feeling of empowerment is helpful itself.
It could be empowering, but worrying, right? Like, I feel like if I understand it, if it's so simple that I can understand it, there must be something wrong.
So that's an interesting thing, though, because I've also heard, I've talked to some people who are anthropologists of medicine, and so they study TCM and other traditional medicines, and sometimes outside of the mainstream, like in the villages in China. And they would report something very different than my experience. So my experience is that I like this feeling of empowerment. So yeah, I like learning about the way that TCM approaches health, because it feels very intuitive to me. Like, okay, I feel this today, so I'm going to eat something green, something like that. Or I feel heaty, so I need to eat something cooling. But that's not always what people want. Sometimes people do want to be sort of bowled over with the magic and the mystery of it. And the less they understand, the better, because then that means it's really powerful.
I would like to offer an alternate interpretation. And I've seen studies which show that you're right, patients are vulnerable. They are sick, and they do not have the knowledge to treat themselves or to know what's going on with them or to navigate the different medicines out there for themselves. And there's like the feminist interpretation, which says that just because someone is vulnerable doesn't mean they lack autonomy, and it's okay to be dependent on someone else for their help. And I do respect, though, that there is that feeling of empowerment and that it can come in different ways. So you like the empowerment of the simple explanation that you can do it every day. You have that knowledge. And I think that maybe what we need to move forward to is a better compromise in potentially Western medicine. So both withholding, overbearing information that the patient does not need to know, but giving them just the little bits that they actually could use in their daily life. But yeah, I'm just asking for a system overhaul, nothing big. But with that, I was wondering if patients consent to this treatment for which there is, no evidential explanation. It's more of just what you said, spleen Qi. Yeah. You are lacking orange and therefore you need to take orange. Yeah. Do you think that patients can actually consent to this sort of treatment if there is no evidence that it works?
Yeah. In my opinion, yes. Simple answer. Yeah. So I think that I guess one of the differences or nuances there's knowing that and knowing how, or there's maybe that's not the best way of putting that, but I might not understand why, but I can understand that. I don't understand why aspirin makes me feel better. I don't need to. When I have a headache, I take aspirin, I feel better.
Excellent. Perfect. Moving on.
We're very critical here. we subject ideas to rigorous interrogation.
Yes.
Like, thank you, okay. But I guess there's this tradition in standard medicine that consent has to be informed to a certain extent, right? And yeah, it's true to some extent that we don't need to know everything about something in order to provide informed consent. I don't need to know how aspirin works to be able to consent to it. But we might say, well, at least there's this idea that it's been tested, at least in Western medicine, something's been tested. A lot of scientists would readily back this up, and that might be something that can affect my informed consent, maybe. And that I can think about that and be like, oh, you know what? Even though I don't know how this works, I know that a bunch of people would be willing to put their careers on the line to say that this works. Can we apply that to traditional medicine?
I think you can. So I think trying to say that it's all about informed consent or patient autonomy, those are very liberal bioethics words. But if you think about it maybe more abstractly or more like in fundamental concepts, what you need is trust. And sorry, I bumped the mic. You want to give consent or you give consent to things that you trust and believe, right? So I think the fact that TCM practitioners are, they earn degrees to do what they do. There is some sort of professional vetting that happens. There's a community of people. There are legal regulations. If they give you something that, hurts you, they can be held accountable. So you might not understand the theoretical mechanism or causality behind why a certain root or tea should fix your stomach ulcer or something, but you can understand that they would be held responsible if it didn't or if it harmed you. And I think so those things affect that relationship. I think that can be sufficient for trusting the situation.
That was a really great answer. We have one final question for you. So could Western medicine learn anything from the practice of TCM?
Yes.
No further questions.
Yes. Well, I mean, in many ways. So, I mean, like I said before, there was already that discovery about artemisinin, right? So there are some traditional Chinese remedies that would stand up to scientific rigor. So sometimes that happens. Other times it might be vague. Maybe the effect is really just placebo. But I think even there, going back to the epistemic relationship or dynamics between doctors and patients, I think one of the reasons that people tend to go to traditional medical practitioners is because of the intimacy that they experience and the feeling of care. So there's a lot of strains on Western medicine that I don't want to say that doctors are at fault for this, because sometimes it's the system that just the way it's structured, they don't have a lot of time to spend with patients. So it's kind of like a factory line system. If you're a doctor, you have a really long day of meeting with patients and you get to spend maybe 5-10 minutes with them, and then you have to move them along. And if you take an hour to talk to them about their lives, you're just not going to get to see that many people, and there's limited resources. But that's why people go to the TCM doctor instead, because they do have that time. And we had a colleague come out for one of these papers that we're working on related to this, and he interviewed a bunch of TCM doctors and a bunch of Western medical doctors about their habits and how they try to establish trust with patients. And one of the things that stuck in my mind is that with Western medicine, patients feel this very transactional relationship. When they go to the TCM clinic, they go out for hotpot afterward. So it's really different. And that kind of the human side of things is something that Western medicine has fallen a little bit behind with, I think.
Is that hotpot after every patient?
That would be a lot of hotpot.
Should I become a TCM doctor?
I also don't know if I want to go out for a hotpot with somebody who's seen my X-ray.
They've seen your insides.
Yeah, I've seen my insides. I think I feel a little vulnerable.
Yeah. Would you feel less vulnerable after hotpot, though?
Based on how I cry when I eat hotpot, yes.
Less vulnerable?
No. Can confirm, incredibly vulnerable while eating a hotpot. I could not stand up to anyone. I'm weak.
Okay. Final question.
Mm-hmm.
So as somebody who is an expert on philosophy and TCM, you clearly know a lot about qi. So how do I get to the point where I can run on top of the trees like wind?
Well, you have to cultivate it for like 1,000 years at least.
Oh, I don't have that long.
But if you start now, preserve your tea. Well, some of there actually are.
There actually are people who can run to the top of
There
tea.
actually are people who say that they can help you get there. There's I don't know. I've met too many TCM practitioners, I guess.
And should I trust them?
Well, this is one of those untestable hypotheses. Like maybe they are out there.
Well, like you don't believe hard enough.
Like I'm not gonna be around in 1,000 years to like test this. So
Her reputation is not on the line.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this chat. I feel like I've learnt a lot. You had some great answers. Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBME and you and be savvy.